Today I'm going to take you guys through the best Warzone Season 2 settings to boost your FPS and maximize your visibility. It's the beginning of a new season, so everyone's going to be on Warzone trying to grind it out, and you need to make sure you've got these settings set up so you're not hindering yourself when you're maximizing your efficiency in your gunfights. So let's start off in the display section of the graphics area of the settings menu. We're going to start off on the display mode option, which I have set to full screen borderless at the moment. I've always in the past said run it at full screen, and I would still say, honestly, try full screen and full screen borderless out. Full screen borderless gives you the advantage of not having any bugs from alt-tabbing. Warzone has a lot of problems at the moment where you can alt-tab, and when you alt-tab back into a full screen game, your FPS goes all kind of weird. You get all this jittering. I don't really know what's causing it, and because of that, I've switched to full screen borderless recently. However, I would say try them both out. Full screen should give you better overall performance if you're not alt-tabbing a lot. It's just for me, someone who does a lot of multitasking, full screen borderless is good, so stick to one of these two options and you'll get the best results. Next, display monitor. Obviously, just have it set to whichever monitor you're playing the game on, so I'm playing it through my capture card, my Elgato capture card, so I've got it selected here. Display adapter, make sure this is set to your GPU. You'll probably only have one option here anyway, but if you accidentally select maybe your integrated graphics, if that's even an option on here, then you will be hindering your performance dramatically, but you'll hopefully figure that out already. Screen refresh rate, just make sure that this is set to the refresh rate of your monitor. Because I'm in full screen borderless, it locks it to 240, which is the hertz of my monitor. But if you are playing in full screen, make sure you do have this set correctly. If you've got a 144 Hz monitor, make sure this is set to 144, or else you're not getting that pure refresh rate that you're paying for with your monitor. Next up, render resolution. This, I would recommend always starting at 100. I would never really recommend going over 100 because all it does is it starts to basically double down on your resolution. So if I was to put this up to something like 200, I end up playing at 4K resolution rather than 1080p. That will make your game look sharper, yes, but it will also tank your FPS completely. So 100% is just going to mean you're running at native resolution. You can also drop this down if you're having issues with FPS. If you go through all these settings and you're just really struggling, come in here, lower this to maybe 80. You'll definitely gain some FPS from doing that at the cost of the game being a bit more blurry. So set it to 100 for now. Try out all my settings that I'm going to give you today, and then come back here if you really need a bit of an FPS boost. If you click in advanced, just make sure your display resolution, the base display resolution, is set at your native resolution. For me, 1080p. This dynamic resolution, I'd recommend you disable. I'd rather that you drop your resolution down rather than try and set a dynamic resolution where it changes resolution with FPS. I'm not a massive fan of this option, so I would leave that. And then dynamic resolution frame rate target. This isn't going to do anything because we've got dynamic resolution disabled. Aspect ratio, just set it to automatic. If that looks weird for whatever reason, and you don't think the aspect ratio is right, you've got black bars appearing or something, then you can come in here and select what actually is your aspect ratio. For me, that would be 16:9. For some people with ultra wide, you might have 21:9 or even 32:9 if you've got one of those mega ultra wide monitors. But for most people, just set it to automatic or try 16:9 and just make sure you've got the correct aspect ratio set up. Next, sync every frame. Make this disabled. We do not want VSync on. It will limit your frame rate to reduce screen tearing, but it adds input lag. That is not good for Warzone. We do not want added input lag where you do something with your mouse. Typically, you give it a bit of a move and there's a bit of a delay. That can happen when you have VSync on, so keep this disabled. Custom frame rate limit. I would recommend just setting this to custom and just dragging it all the way to the right. There's no reason to have this game limited in terms of FPS. The game runs the best when you just let it have all the FPS it needs. You're not going to be hitting 300 FPS, more than likely, but just set it all the way to the right in terms of gameplay so that you're hitting whatever the max FPS you can hit is. For menu custom frame rate limit, I do recommend you drop it down a little bit. I like my menu to still be quite fluid, so I've got it set to around 100. It's just a average thing. I could actually put in 100 here. It doesn't actually matter. I just like it to be a bit more fluid than 60. And then out of focus custom frame rate limit, just put it to 30 because when you alt tab out the game, you don't want it pulling loads of resources, especially if you are trying to multitask while you're in the menus and stuff. Brightness, very important thing here. Turn this to 55. It's by default at 50. I think the game's a bit dark. Ignore these things over here. Oh, they've gone. Ignore these things over here where it says, oh, you want to try and make this barely visible. It's not a good thing to follow. Set it to 55. You get a little bit more brightness. You get a little bit more clarity in the game, especially when we're in some of those dark areas on Rebirth Island and Caldera. Display gamma, put this to 2.2 if you're on a monitor. Put it to 2.4 if you're on a TV. Simple as that. Nvidia highlights keep these disabled. If you want to record your game, do it manually through Shadowplay or through OBS. Do not use Nvidia highlights. It does pull a bit of resource that we do not want the game to be using. Lastly, Nvidia Reflex Low Latency. Put this to enabled plus boost, assuming that you are in a CPU bound case. What that means, and this is what it's going to be for a lot of people, is that you've got a much stronger GPU than a CPU. For me, I've got a 3070 as my GPU, so a damn strong GPU, and then my CPU is an older i7, and as you can see here, GPU clock frequencies will be kept high in CPU-bound cases. If you have what you consider to be a stronger CPU than a GPU, maybe like an older GPU and a really strong, powerful CPU, you can actually try putting this to just enabled. So if you really don't know whether you're in a CPU or a GPU-bound case, try both these out for a couple of games, see which one gives you the best results, note down some FPSs. For me and many other people, enabled plus boost is going to work out absolutely fine. Let's move into quality now, which is probably what most of you come in here for to look through. Field of view, I see no reason to put this on anything lower than 120 FOV. As a PC player, you want to be utilizing every bit of FOV possible. The normal disadvantages of using a higher FOV, which are not being able to see enemies as easier because they actually shrink on your screen as your FOV gets wider. That, and also the fact that having a higher FOV can technically affect your FPS because there's more on screen. Both of those have very minimal effect in Warzone as a game, and so I'd recommend put it on 110 minimum if that just feels comfortable, but try and make your way to 120. It will make your whole experience in terms of what you're able to see and what information you're able to gather far better. Advanced, put ADS field of view to affected. Very, very important here. What this does, if you have this set to independent, when you zoom in with a one-time scope or with iron sights, you will zoom really far in. You'll zoom in to the standard FOV, basically, that you have without changing your FOV slider here. If we put it to affected, then because we've increased our FOV in the slider here to the highest, we'll also keep very wide FOV when we scope in. This means that you get far less visual recoil on your gun, and you'll see that most streamers and pros have this on. It will technically mean it's a bit harder to keep track of enemies at distance because you're not zoomed in, but the lack of the visual recoil is just too much to not have this set to affected. Camera movement, put this to least. We do not want really intense camera shake as we're doing anything in Warzone. It's distracting and it will not help your gameplay, so keep this on least. I would love to turn it off, but there's a sense of realism that the game's trying to keep, maybe a sense of fairness, so least is all we can go to. Streaming quality, put this on low. It says that it will favor the texture performance over quality. We're not really caring too much about the overall texture fidelity. When it comes to texture resolution, I do keep it at normal because it just means that you don't have complete blurriness everywhere. And me being a content creator, I do like to keep it looking somewhat nice. If you are purely going for FPS, like purely, and that's all you care about, you can put it to very low and you might gain a very small amount of FPS. This is only really going to be if you're on a much older GPU. If you're on a semi-modern GPU, I'm talking anything like even a 1080 onwards, just put this to normal. It's all to do with your VRAM. If you have a card with 2 GB of VRAM or less, maybe put this on very low. If you have anything over that, put it to normal. It's not going to make any effect to your FPS, and it's going to make your game look a bit better and give you more clarity in terms of spotting enemies against certain bits of the background. Trust me on this one. Texture filter anisotropic, very similar to texture resolution. Having it turned to normal makes the game look a bit clearer, a bit more defined. It allows you to spot enemies a little easier, and it does not affect FPS really at all going from low to normal. Particle quality, this has always been a really weird one. Most people will default to putting this on low, but it's actually been proven that having this on high gives you better FPS. Who knows why? I don't know. Bullet impact and sprays. I like to keep these enabled. It's purely preference. I just think it adds that little bit of realism. It doesn't really make a difference. Completely up to you guys. Tessellation. Disable this. Doesn't really add anything to the game and has a small effect on FPS. Whilst it's only a small effect, yeah, it doesn't really do anything in terms of how the game looks, so I just keep it disabled. Dismemberment and gore effects, turn them to disabled as well. This is actually to reduce the kind of the visual noise of what's going on when you're shooting enemies. As you can see on the side, it says human characters get dismembered when shot by heavy rounds, and there's gore effects are applied to shooting dead bodies and all this other stuff. It's just added visual noise. It's just stuff we don't really need to see. We don't want this stuff to be getting in the way of potentially a kill or spotting something. It's unlikely to ever cause a problem, but it also doesn't add anything to the game, so keep it off. On-demand texture streaming, keep this disabled. This means that you download textures to your hard disk from the internet, so you can keep nice textures. It says here texture resolution has to be set to high in order to show those high quality textures. As you can see, I've got mine set to normal anyway, so there's absolutely no point for me to be downloading textures as I play the game. Definitely not something that anyone who's focused on performance should be doing. If you ever have any problems, this is an important setting, restart shader installation. If you start to have really weird FPS problems and you just can't get rid of them, come in here, restart your shader install. Takes about 5 minutes to do the install, and hopefully after that your game will be running smooth. Very important tip there. Post-processing effects. Make sure filmic strength is set to 1. The reason we do this is because it specifically says here that if our anti-aliasing option is not set to SMAA T2X or filmic SMAA T2X, then we should set this to 1. As you can see, our anti-aliasing, I put mine at SMAA 1X, which isn't either of those options, so I need to put this to 1. Talking about anti-aliasing, you can turn it off if you are happily going to have the jagged edges that appear on everything. I feel like they're really, really bad in Warzone though, so I do like to put on a little bit of anti-aliasing. This is very much an FPS versus visibility debate. Having it off will increase your FPS. Having it on will increase your visibility. It's going to come down to your system. If you've got a decent enough system to run SMAA 1X without really losing too much FPS, then go for that. If not, you're going to have to run it with off to just gain those FPS values that you really need. Film grain, definitely 0. It's really bad for visibility, not something we want in a competitive game. Nvidia DLSS, I would recommend that you keep this disabled. It can be very useful if you're playing at 2K or 1440p and above. I'm playing at 1080p, so it's really not helpful for me. If you're playing at 1440p, try out putting this to quality and see how it works for you. It might actually work really nicely for you. It might give you really clear gameplay and increased FPS, but it's hard for me to talk on it because I do not have 1440p as my main monitor. So for most people out there, keep it to disabled. Depth of field, disabled. World motion blur, disabled. And weapon motion blur, disabled. All things which are not good for visibility. Lastly, in this area, shadow and lighting. Shadow map resolution, I would recommend most people put this to normal. This is kind of similar to textures, except to an even crazier degree. Low shadows look horrific. They look absolutely dreadful, to the point where it actually makes me not like playing the game. Going from low to normal shadows is a very, very minor FPS loss. So once again, it comes down to, is your GPU any decent? If you can go from low to normal, try them both out, and you only lose a small amount of FPS, you gain a crazy amount in terms of visibility and just gameplay fidelity. If you have to, then you're going to have to turn it to low. Up to you guys. Cache spot shadows and cache sun shadows enable both of these. What they do is it causes the game to use additional RAM. If you're running 16 gigs of RAM, which most people are, then you can turn this on, both of these, and you will gain major increased performance in terms of how the shadows are stored on your PC and not having to regenerate those shadows every time you come across them. Very important setting. Particle lighting, keep that to low. DirectX ray tracing, definitely disable it. It's not going to be useful for FPS and it's not going to be useful for visibility. It is eye candy for single player games, not for Warzone. Ambient occlusion, keep this to disabled. It adds a little bit of softness to shadows, more realistic shadows, but doesn't really help visibility, and it does affect FPS decently. And then screen space reflections, once again, is pretty much not useful, and it can affect your FPS. And then finally, it also says that they will show visual noise if you're not using one of those two anti-aliasing options that we already said we weren't using from earlier. So keep that disabled. In terms of other settings that are important in here, if we come to interface, I like to have my colorblind type set to deuteranopia. Now, I am actually colorblind, but this colorblind type has nothing to do with that. Having this set to deuteranopia and colorblind target to both increases the colors of the game in quite a natural way. It makes the game look far better, especially on Caldera. The game has become less washed out since when we played on Verdansk, but this really pushes it to the limit and gives you some of that nice color back into the game. There are other ways you can gain color by doing things in terms of Nvidia filters and the Nvidia control panel. If you want a video on that, then leave a comment below and I can do a video on that as well. Also, make sure you've got minimap shape in here set to square. The reason that we do that is you see on the right here, we actually just gain more minimap. So if someone was up in this top right corner, you'd be able to see them on the square minimap. You wouldn't be able to see them on the circle minimap. So definitely make sure you've got this set to square. Anyway, guys, before I end this video, I have a question for you. Would you like to level up a gun in just 3 to 4 games in the new Warzone season? Well, I do have a video covering that just over here. So don't miss it, because it is a very well hidden strategy using Rebirth Island to gain incredible weapon XP. So go check out that video next. Thank you very much for watching, guys. I'll catch you guys there. Bye-bye.